The wired
All right.
word
Wired word, that is it. It's about connecting current events
with,
with Bible studies. We have plenty of current events.
oh, they.
When I read it, though, I read it. That doesn't look political.
Okay, let's get started. We'll give Bill plenty of time today. Bill, if you'll stop about 10:40, we'll be good. We'll get back to church in time. Glad you're here. Last Sunday of winter. Doesn't feel like it. It's going to be 82 degrees today. So, at any rate, but we're glad you're here. We've got several things. I think there's one great announcement that's on here you need to read on page 8 of your order of worship. One of our former members, Alice Wilhoit, is starting a new class.
Yeah, I was like.
Isn't that great? She's starting one. They're a group of people who never go, who don't have a Sunday school class, and maybe they don't want one. That's okay. So if they don't want one, that's okay too. But anyway, this is a class that will give an opportunity, a new opportunity for that if they want. We have several other things that are on the announcements. Of course, Kate Campbell will be here Saturday, April 14th. Easter is April 1st. It's a great comment on the irony of that on page 8. Let's see. Is there anything else? Anything else that I'm missing church-wide that we ought to announce before we turn it over to Bill? If not, Bill, if you'll just go for it. And then about 20 till, I'm going to pass the prayer request book around, and we'll go from there. Thank you, Bill.
You bet. Well, I'll pick up where we left off last week, and our text of the morning does not indicate that that's where we're going to pick up, but we are, because there's a gap in there that we need to fill in. You'll remember last week we ended with the Passover and the last plague, and the Egyptian, the Pharaoh said, "You can leave." And in chapter 12, verse 33, it says, "And the Egyptians urged the people to send them out of the land in haste, for they said, we shall all be dead." So the Egyptians were ready to get rid of them when after that last plague. And so here they go off. Not sure really where they were going. Didn't have good map service back then. And so they're heading to the desert. And chapter 13, a strange chapter. It talks about the consecration of the firstborn. Animals, children, firstborn. And it even hints that if they're not consecrated, they might be killed. It doesn't follow up on any of that, but it's there. And we find in that same 13th chapter that God led the children of Israel with a pillar of fire at night and a cloud by day. And they took Joseph's bones with them when they left Egypt. And because Joseph had wanted to be buried in the promised land. So they knew something about the promised land, even in the day of Joseph. That 14th chapter you're all familiar with. Here comes Pharaoh with his army. The children of Israel are camped at the Red Sea. And as the army approaches, the children of Israel get mad at Moses again and say, you've let us out here to die in the wilderness. And the Red Sea parts. Children of Israel go through the Red Sea, comes back together again. And in the next chapter, chapter 15, verses 1 through 18, we find a beautiful song of celebration because of the deliverance from the Red Sea. And as they cross the Red Sea, they travel for 3 days, and they're thirsty. They get mad at Moses again because they're all thirsty. And they come to Marah, and there's a pool of water there, and they start to drink of it, and it's bitter. And the Lord performed another miracle. There's a tree there, and they cut down the tree and throw it into the water, and it becomes good water to drink. So they're happy with Moses again. And in chapter 16, we're not going to touch on that much because we're going to touch on that next week. But it's the story of the manna, God feeding the children of Israel with manna. every day. It's an interesting word, by the way, in case it's not brought up next week. The word manna literally means, what is it? So every morning they'd go out and gather some, what is it? We have no idea what that really
I think we had manna last night for dinner.
You're not gonna have any dinner tonight, I'll bet you.
That couch is gonna sleep good, Jim.
He hasn't learned yet.
Yeah, wait.
He's been married a year, he hasn't learned yet.
He said that, we have to ask him.
Right, yeah.
He did the cooking.
Well, they get thirsty again. And so they come to this rock and they're mad at Moses again, and Moses hits the rock and water comes out and everything's good and well. In chapter 17, verses 1 through 7. The latter part of that chapter 17 is the first war that we know of that the children of Israel had. And they had a war with Amalek. And you'll remember Moses, as long as he would hold his arms up, they would defeat the enemy. And when he got tired, the enemy would start winning. So Aaron and Hur, H-U-R, hold his arms up for him. I'm sorry? No. They get under his arms and hold his arms up, and the children of Israel were able to win the war. And in chapter 18, we find Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, coming and saying to him, Moses, you're going to work yourself to death. You're available to all the people all the time, and you got to do something, and here's a plan. So Jethro helped Moses divide the nation up and put an elder in charge of each nation. And that organizational chart has been in existence since then for almost every business and every church in the world that grows to be any size, of dividing it up and giving authority to people who can handle the authority. And so Jethro did a wonderful thing for Moses when he helped organize the nation. Now we come to chapter 19, where we're supposed to land this morning. And in chapter 19, we find them at the base of the mountain. And Moses is going up on the mountain. And in verse 3 it says, Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, Tell the sons of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings, and brought you to myself. Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which you shall speak to the sons of Israel. I would remind you that they had no written word from God. That really did not officially take place till over 50 years after the death of Jesus. At the Council of Jamnia in 98 AD, they came together and decided what ought to be in the Old Testament and what shouldn't be in the Old Testament. You know, our Old Testament is different from the Catholic Old Testament. It includes books like the 3 books of Maccabees, which our Old Testament does not. So there was a great deal of controversy about which books ought to be included in the Old Testament and which should not be included. Many of those which weren't included, by the way, were repetitious of those that were included. But just a reminder, this is really early on, the children of Israel have no written word, they have no place of worship, no tabernacle, hundreds of years before the temple. And really the only thing they've got to go on is their memory of what God has done for them. you only have to look at their relationship to Moses to find out that memory isn't always that good and that strong. And so here they are again. Moses goes up on the mountain and is confronted by God, and God begins to talk to Moses and tells him, I want Israel, the Hebrew people, to be my special people. You heard that before? Not only from Israel, but just about every nation in the world feels like they're God's special people. I mean, look at the Germans during World War II. Look at our own nation. Look at our chaplains during the Vietnam War, when they would go out each morning and consecrate the bombers before they took off to kill the Vietnamese. I mean, this is the thing with almost every nation on earth. We are God's special people. And God designated that for Israel. And verse 5 is really interesting. Now then, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, that is, if you'll keep your end of the bargain, you'll be my special people. What is a covenant?
An agreement?
I'm sorry?
I said an agreement,
It's an agreement
contract.
between two parties. And this idea of a covenantal relationship and you are my people is an idea that's repeated 50 times in the book of Deuteronomy alone. And so God was really trying hard to establish in the mind of the Jewish people that they had a special relationship with Him.
Bill?
Yeah.
I had a question. Really not from 19, but I read from all the way through 32. But from the moment they left Egypt, I mean, I'm guessing that the period of time was pretty short. The Egyptians followed them, and the whole Red Sea thing happened. But from that point forward, I never could get a sense of time. I mean, did they wander around for a year, 10 years, 40 days? I mean,
40 years.
40 years. It was 40 years.
40 years total.
So that kind of explains then the shortness of memory. Because they'd say they're going to do something, and then in the next verse or the next chapter, they broke what they said they were going to do. So that sort of explains that.
And I think somebody one time showed on the map where they were wandering, and it was actually a really, really tiny area. It was like they were walking circles this whole time.
Which is what happens to a person when they walk in the desert. If they're right-handed, they lead with their right foot, and they just make a circle. They go in a circle. If you're left-handed, you go in the other way.
I'm not
But anyway,
an expert on that, but I am an expert on the fact that he doesn't delineate dates and years
It
during
doesn't.
that 40 years.
So I couldn't get a sense of how long this
Yeah.
was.
Occasionally, you'll find a reference to 3 days, something like that.
Okay.
But,
But I struggled with the memory lapses.
yeah.
That when you read it, they say they're going to do something, and then it seems like the next chapter, they forgot they said they were going to do it, and they broke them.
Yeah.
So I was having a hard time. 40 years, I guess, explains that. So it's like a generation or two.
Is this also where the generations, he doesn't deliver them to the real promised land until all of the people that were in Egypt had died? That were slaves in there?
That comes later.
Later, okay.
That comes later.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. The other interesting thing about this 19th chapter is God is trying to teach the people a lesson about reverence. And he says to Moses, and Moses says to the people, don't come near the mountain. Don't touch the mountain. If you touch the mountain, you're going to die. And so it's a lesson in reverence, a sense of respect for God, awe of God's power. And I mean, it seems very harsh, you know. You touch that mountain, you're going to die. But the children of Israel, remember where they are. They have no concept of reverence, no concept of the almighty power of God other than what they have seen through the plagues. And have we lost a sense of reverence today? Some of you are about as long in the tooth as I am. And in our lifetimes, I have observed a severe loss of reverence and respect for who God is. And we'll touch on that more in a few minutes. But that 19th chapter is full of God trying to teach them to respect people.
You know, when you talk about the awe of God or the fear, of God, when you think about in here, I think it's all in Exodus that, the people grumbled and they complained about the manna. It tasted, they didn't like it, although it's.
Boy, you complain too if that's all you had to eat.
That's
for
true
40
for 40 years. I probably would. But the thing that always strikes me when I read that is that he opened up the earth and 10,000 people were swallowed up, because they grumbled and complained. And he did that twice. I don't know if the number was exactly the same, but I think that was close. And I think, we're just whiners sometimes. We want, in America especially, because we have everything. We want everything. We want it now. If you're of the wrong political party, that's a horrible dissension right now between the two parties. And so that's a thing we're grumbling about. We're just never happy anymore.
Yeah.
As a country, I think there's a lot.
You may have seen the paper this week. Every year they do this happiness survey among nations. And one of the Norway or Finland seems to come out on top
Right.
almost every year.
Yeah.
And we dropped 2 slots this year. I can't remember if we dropped 15 to 17 or 17 to 19. Do you all recall?
I thought we dropped 3. I thought it was 18. It matters.
My memory's not too good these days.
But Finland was the one that.
But at any rate, that chapter ends with God telling the children of Israel, don't touch the mountain. Now, Dennis, I need a little guidance here. I couldn't tell from the outline whether we're to deal with the 10 Commandments or not.
Oh, yeah, let's do it.
We're to deal with the
Yeah.
10 Commandments.
Yes,
Okay,
and the golden calf.
all right. That shortens the end of the lesson, but we'll do it. Chapter 20. Then God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. First commandment. You shall not make for yourself an idol or any likeness of what is in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the water under the earth. You shall not worship them or serve them, for I am the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, on the 3rd and 4th generations of those who hate me, but showing loving kindness to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. Number 3, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not leave him unpunished. Number 4, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your sons or your daughters, your male or your female servant, or your cattle, or your sojourner who stays with you. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. All right, the first 5 commandments deal with one's relationship to God. The next 5 commandments deals with one's relationship to their fellow man. First one, you shall have no other gods before me. All of these are hard, folks. They're all hard. And most of us in this room would say we don't have any other gods before God. But what we give our love, affection, money, time, those things become our God. And we can, you know, say all we want about having no other gods, but just check your schedule, your checkbook, and you may discover who your real God is. Tough. Number 2, you shall not make for yourself an idol or any likeness of what is in heaven above, and so forth. And 1052 was the first major split in the Christian church. And it was the split that produced the Orthodox movement in the church. Eastern Orthodox versus Roman Catholic. And this was the issue. The Eastern Orthodox, who split off, did not believe in any graven images. And the Catholics to this day have graven images in their churches. And they would tell you they don't worship those graven images, by the way, and being fair to them. But they have graven images. The Eastern Orthodox do not. And so the very first major split in the Christian church came over the second commandment. By the way, I don't like to lecture all the time, so feel free to wave me down, ask questions, or interrupt.
About that, it says, idol image, and I'm thinking of stained glass windows.
I'm hard of hearing.
I'm just thinking of paintings that you see in churches or anywhere else. I mean, some people really take a hard line about it. And they have those the very plain churches with nothing at all.
Yeah.
And I mean, do you think it applies to every kind of image or representation?
Yes. My personal feeling is it applies to that which you place in place of God, not that which enhances your understanding, appreciation, and worship of God.
Okay.
Some of you saw this display down in our lobby. Man, that woman worked her fingers to the bone to produce that beautiful, and it helped my appreciation for the majesty of God. And so, and some people might view that as an image. I viewed it as a work of art to help me understand.
Bill, Laura and I were at Broadway for 25 years before we moved to this side of the Metroplex, and Broadway has beautiful stained glass windows, as you were talking about, Kelly, and you mentioned there. And on one side of the church, all the windows are scenes from the Old Testament, and there's a top, there's a crown. And if you do this virtue, this is how you win your crown. And on the other side are all New Testament. And the front and the back of the church is a come you window for people to join, and a go you window when you leave, that sort of thing. And it's just a very, like you said, it was a very powerful image every Sunday to see those kind of things and to remind you where you are.
Yeah.
You're not just in any room.
Yeah.
You're in a sacred place, and they're a very powerful image.
Architecture can do marvelous things. If any of you have never been to the St. Mary's Church in San Francisco, Catholic Church, if you ever go to San Francisco again, look it up. At the end of every pew, the pulpit, everything in there points upwards. And you walk in there, you go up. You just can't help it. So, but I think what this is a prohibition against is worshiping something instead of God. And I don't think it's a prohibition against that which will help us to worship God.
Yeah, I was going to say, I love the poetry that's in the King James Version. Because it talks about the trees flapping. And all trees point upward. And nature itself is the glory of God. So, I mean, if He made everything, it's all in that attitude.
Yeah. All right, the next commandment is in verse 7. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. For the Lord will not leave him unpunished who takes his name in vain. Wow. How we as a society have diminished and cheapened the name of God by so casually taking his name in vain. And I mean, from our political leaders right on through television and the movies and what we read, it may be one of the most commandments that's most often broken. Verse 8, remember the Sabbath day, keep it holy. You know, when I was a young man, you didn't schedule anything on the Sabbath. In Oklahoma, there were blue laws. And
They were here.
They were here too.
in
Yeah.
Texas as well. Stores didn't open on the Sabbath. And we had a better chance to rest. And every time I read this commandment, I'm reminded of the fact that I worked harder on Sunday than any other day of the week. In Siloam Springs, we didn't have a store open in 1968 when I moved there on Sunday. And a grocery chain came in there and started opening on Sunday. And all of us ministers got together and we made a big deal out of let's boycott this grocery store because they're opening on Sunday and they're going to cause all the other grocery stores to open on Sunday. And so we really made a public push for that, and people really went into that grocery store on Sunday and bought their stuff.
And here in Texas, I was actually working in a grocery store while I was in school. They had certain items, you could buy food items and so on like this, but you couldn't buy if they had a toy or something like that. And they would cover them up, and if they came through the check line, we had to say, no, you can't do that. And
You couldn't buy pantyhose.
no, you
I
couldn't.
remember that was one.
Right.
Oh my, that's a bad idea on Sunday morning. That's a terrible, at least a man made that.
Yeah. And so, then finally, they opened it up that you could buy anything, except, of course, we didn't have, in Texas, in Dallas, we didn't have alcohol in the grocery stores, which we do now, and then you can buy anything, probably including the store on Sunday if you wanted to.
And yet,
Come to Wilshire.
I'm sorry?
I started coming to Wilshire for one main reason is that they started opening on Sunday and I had to work on Sunday. So I could come in and go from a nice service into sometimes hectic, work. But at least I could go to work. I mean, I could go to church. It wasn't good. I think in Germany, they did not allow, hardly anybody goes to church.
Yeah.
The unions won't let them open on Sunday if they're something secular, you need a day off. I don't know if it's still true.
The
My
church.
oven that I got just a couple years ago actually has a Sabbath
The
mode on
stores
it,
can-
so you actually
Retail
don't.
unions.
I don't know, I haven't figured out how to work it.
So
I put it in that book, it doesn't come on.
But it was made, it's a Bosch, so it was made in Germany, I guess, I don't know.
Interesting.
Yeah, I
Go to
know.
church.
I
Of course, none of
should
us
probably
go out
play
to
around
eat
with
on
this.
Sunday.
Do what?
None of us go out to eat on Sunday.
Well, I tell you what, in Israel, you'll find out of course, their Sabbath is on Saturday, but at sundown on Friday, the elevators buttons quit working.
Where's that?
In Israel, the elevator buttons stop working. And the elevator works, but it goes up to the first floor, it stops. It goes up to the second floor, it stops.
You don't have to
It goes
push
to
the
the
button,
front,
yeah.
and it goes back down and back down and back down, and it just continuously does that. And on Sunday, they always have this unbelievable buffet for breakfast. All their meals were this way, except on Saturday morning. You can't even get coffee because it uses electricity. It was an eye-opening deal.
Well, in our country, the Seventh-day Adventists, of course, worship on Saturday, and they probably do as good a job as any other religious organization in respecting their Sabbath. And I really respect the Seventh-day Adventists for the way they stick to that. In Arkansas, in Siloam Springs, a Seventh-day Adventist guy opened up a car dealership, and he closed that dude on Saturday. And everybody expected him to go under because he closed it on Saturday. Man, he almost ran everybody out of business because he opened on Sunday. And the rest of the car dealerships, you know, were closed on Sunday. So, but it's hard, and our involvement in it is hard, all right?
We've talked about the grocery stores and the liquor stores and stuff, but y'all would not believe, when we started opening the libraries in the late 1980s, we did surveys, we did all sorts of stuff before that decision was made. It was not made likely that there would be one branch open on Sunday in every region of the city. And now there are a lot of libraries, of course, that open on Sunday. It was a huge issue. It just wasn't something that came down from city council, you will do this. Big deal.
All right, the first of the commandments that deal with one's relationship to another is in verse 12. Honor your father and mother that your days may be prolonged in the land which the Lord your God gives you. Here again, this is a commandment that God gave, and with the promise that your days would be prolonged. And I have observed through the years that families that have a whole lot of tension in them, many of those families experience death within the family. Tension is a killer. I mean, it's just a killer. And if you're right with your children and you're right with the people in your family, you have a tendency to live longer. All right, verse 13, you shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal or bear false witness or covet. Any questions about those? I mean, they're pretty clear and pretty laid out.
Ten Commandment is not 10 suggestions, particular for all of us. It's not a 12 steps for the AAs either. It's God for us to keep. I honestly truth say it's hard to keep up as Christian, to keep up with our life today. So many things happens, and somewhere here and there we compromise that. But reality is, we have to do our best, or at least we try to do our best to follow. I do not know any of us have a house. We have probably have a cross in our house, a Bible in the living room to symbolize that. And sometimes I just, when I listen to Bill talking, I said, why I have a 10 Commandments in the house to remind me of what God says. Every day, look at the picture, look at the words, reminded me. That's us Christians should do. Yes, I compromise so many times, but as a Christian, we have to remind ourselves that's 10 Commandments. It's not 10 suggestions for you to follow.
Robert, you lead me into a quote from Doyle Sager, who's pastor of First Baptist Church in Jefferson City, Missouri. And Doyle wrote a few months ago, instead of using the 10 Commandments as a grid to guide our personal preferences, we use our personal preferences to interpret the 10 Commandments. That's a mouthful. George Bernard Shaw said, and I quote him, "God created us in His image, and we decided to return the favor."
That's right.
You know, Mark Twain was not a person who suffered fools gladly. And in a public meeting, Mark Twain heard this guy talking about his life's desire was to go to Israel and see all the sights and climb the mountain where Moses received the Ten Commandments. And finally, Twain interrupted him and said, instead of going to Israel to see the Ten Commandments, wouldn't it be better to keep the Ten Commandments at home? The fact is, none of us keep the Ten Commandments. None of us. And that's the reason that there became a new covenant. And that covenant was with Jesus. And it is much harder to keep the new covenant than the old covenant. The old covenant mainly deals with actions. The new covenant deals with the heart, which produces actions. The new covenant is full of grace. The old covenant is full of law. Grace makes law palatable. And so we have a new covenant with Christ, thank God. Otherwise, we're all sunk if we have only the 10 to deal with. All right, any questions about the Ten Commandments? All right.
So just what you said means we don't have to obey the Ten Commandments?
No,
No,
no.
no.
I'm saying that the new covenant is harder than the old covenant because it deals with the heart. And the heart is what produces that which causes us to break the Ten Commandments. The heart produces our actions.
You know, it's almost like teaching a child.
Mm-hmm.
In the very beginning of their life, they have to have rules. And then they move from the rules to the substance that you're talking about.
You remind me that the scribes and the Pharisees started dividing the commandments up into sub-commandments. And by the time of Jesus, the 10 Commandments have become 364 commandments. So if you think trying to keep the 10 is tough, try to keep the 364 that had evolved by the time of Jesus. All right, look at verses 18 to 21. And all the people perceived the thunder and the lightning flashes and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking. And when people saw it, they trembled and stood at great distance. Then they said to Moses, "Speak to us yourself, and we will listen. But let not God speak to us, lest we die." And Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid, for God has come in order to test you, and in order that the fear of him may remain with you, so that you may not sin." So the people stood at a distance while Moses approached the thick cloud where God was. Here again, keeping their distance from that mountain. And that's a good thing. All right, we won't spend much time in chapters 21 through 31, but let me just hit some of the highlights of those chapters. In chapter 21 and 22, we find civil and criminal laws. Now remember where the children of Israel were. Brand new nation, wandering out in the wilderness. They didn't have any laws. And so Moses begins to give them some laws. You've got to have some laws if you're going to have a land, if you're going to have a community, if you're going to have people living together. And so in these two chapters, he gives not only civil, but also criminal laws. And chapter 21, verses 1 through 11, he gives laws concerning slavery. Interestingly enough, every 7th year, this is the beginning of the year of Jubilee, every 7th year you had to free your slaves. Every 7th year. Would that have saved some lives in our country during the Civil War? In 12 through 17, he talked about capital offenses. Verses 12 through 14, premeditated murder is a capital offense. Stealing a man in verse 16 is a capital offense. Verse 17, if you curse your parents, it's a capital offense.
We have a bunch of little kids.
We find in the book of Deuteronomy that if you disobey your parents, you're to be stoned to death. Seems pretty harsh, but remember where they were in developmental stages. And in the latter part of that 21st chapter, he talks about a multitude of non-capital crimes. And in chapter 22, he talks about property rights and ethical and moral responsibilities. Chapter 23, he talks about justice and duty toward one's enemy. And then beginning in chapter 24 through 31, we get into the nitty-gritty of establishing a society. For here he gives laws concerning governing religious institutions and practices, and he gives instructions on how to enter the promised land, and then he establishes the priestly ordinances for the sanctuary and the ministry of the priest. So those chapters deal primarily with laws that are designed to help the children of Israel develop a society in which they can all live. All right, in chapter 32, let's look at verses 11 through 14 of 32. Beginning with verse 11. Then Moses entreated the Lord his God and said, O Lord, why doth thine anger burn against thy people? Now remember, they've just created the golden calf. And while Moses is up on the mountain, they asked Joshua to build the golden calf. Remember them getting all this gold and jewelry from the Egyptians right before they leave Israel? Guess what they do with it? They bring it to Moses, to Aaron, and say, here Aaron, make us a golden calf, something to worship. Now, some commentators have guessed that this is a reference back, them referring back to the gods of Egypt, and in their mind worshiping the Egyptian gods. They're dead wrong on that. If you read that, disregard it, because the Egyptians worshiped live animals, not dead animals. And here they build a golden calf, a dead animal. And so they are not worshiping any Egyptian god. We don't know why they are building this golden calf.
Bill, it seems like the irony is just, I mean, Moses is up getting the 10 Commandments on the mountain, and they're down breaking number 2. Of course, they, I guess they don't know it yet, but I mean,
That's it, they don't know it
they don't know it yet, but they're about to, I guess. But.
Yeah. And that 7th verse, it says they corrupted themselves, and that phrase literally refers to a sexual orgy. So while Moses is up on the mountain, they're down here at the bottom of the mountain, building a golden calf and having sexual orgies. Unbelievable how short the memory is.
Bill, I think the best thing that I ever heard explain some of their behavior was these were like freed prisoners. They had never had to live on their own because they were slaves in Egypt. And they didn't know how to live, and I mean, it was like we put stripes on a parking lot so we know how to park our cars, right? So we don't just have chaos out there. Well, they didn't have any lines, and they didn't know how to live, and so this is kind of, you know, this freedom is all new to them.
When the high school students go off to college.
All right, and chapter 32, verse 11 through 14. O Lord, why doth thy anger burn against thy people, whom thou hast brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians speak, saying, with evil intent he brought them out to kill them in the mountains and destroy them from the face of the earth? Turn from thy burning anger and change thy mind about doing harm to thy people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, thy servants, to whom thou didst swear by thyself, and didst say to them, I will multiply your descendants as the stars of the heaven, and all of this land which I have spoken I will give unto your descendants, and they shall inherit it forever. So the Lord changed his mind about the harm which he said he would do to his people. After they built the golden calf, God said, I'm through with you. I'm tired of this. I'm going to destroy all of you. And so Moses makes intercession with God. And look at that last verse, verse 14 again. So the Lord changed his mind about the harm that he was going to do to the children of Israel. At least 50 times in the Old Testament, we find that phrase, God changed his mind. Now that tells us more about the nature of God than anything I can think of. Blows my mind. God didn't make a decision and make it final for eternity about a lot of things. God is capable of changing his mind, which means God is involved in our world. And God can change his mind about things in our world. God is not a static God. He's very much alive. And it is a wonderful attribute of God that he can change his mind. Those of you who are parents, have you ever changed your mind about your relationship with your kids? Well, I had some hard and fast rules that became pretty soft. I think our Heavenly Father may have that same kind of relationship that he desires with us. And that means we shouldn't be too harsh on those who have different points of view than us about their relationship with God. Because they may have sensed that God changed his mind about some things that we haven't. And so we may need to put a little more grace into our thinking about God and what he stands for. I got 5 minutes.
That means we can change his mind.
I'm sorry?
That means we have as children of God, through intercessory prayer, through other means of communicating with him, he will listen to us and change his mind.
We have 50 examples of that in the Old Testament. And that's revelationary, you know, that God can change his mind. Even on the cross, Jesus said, if it be your will, deliver me. Jesus knew the Father could change his mind. And then he said, if not, thy will be done. But yeah, God can change his mind. You know, I grew up knowing that all the Church of Christ and Catholics were going to hell. I mean, I knew that. And, now, did God change his mind, or did my understanding of God change? And I think a lot of times, when we have strong convictions about things, those may be ours instead of God's. And so, let's just try to live with grace. All right, in chapter 32, Moses becomes the covenant mediator between man and God. And in that same chapter, we find that God has said he's not going to go with them. He's going to send an angel to lead them into the promised land. And Moses said, no deal. If you don't go, I ain't going. And so God changed his mind and went with them. God said, I'm not going to go because they're stiff-necked people. And Moses told them that, and they repented from becoming a stiff-necked people. And our section for today ends with chapter 33, verses 7 through 11.
Bill, can I ask you a question first?
Sure.
In 32, this just puzzles me, and I've read this so many times, but in verse 24, whoever has go, this was Aaron talking, whoever has go, take it off. So they gave, he's explaining this to Moses, you know, this is what happened. Take it off. So they gave it to me, and I threw it in the fire, and out came this cat. And I forget every time I read this that he said this, so it's like is he making this up like it pops out? Or did he mold it? I thought somewhere I read that he molded this somewhere else.
Yeah, I think it's his way of saying, well, I didn't have anything to do with that yet. It just happened. We don't know,
Okay.
but that's my take.
Okay, go ahead.
All right, chapter 33, verses 7 to 11. Moses used to take the tent. Now Moses used to take the tent and pitch it outside the camp, a good distance from the camp, and he called it the tent of meeting. And it came about that everyone who sought the Lord would go out to the tent of meeting, which was outside the camp. And it came about whenever Moses went out to the tent, and all the people would arise and stand, each at the entrance of his tent, and gaze after Moses until he entered the tent. And it came about whenever Moses entered the tent, the pillar of cloud would descend and stand at the entrance of the tent. And the Lord would speak to Moses. When all the people saw the pillar of cloud standing at the entrance of the tent, all the people would arise and worship, each at the entrance of his own tent. Thus the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face, just as a man speaks to his friend. And when Moses returned to the camp, his servant Joshua, the son of Nun, a young man, would not depart from the tent. The tent of meeting, where Moses would go to talk with God. And all the children of Israel recognized that. And I leave you with the thought of, why did Joshua stay in the tent? See if you can find that out.
Thank you, Bill. Appreciate it. Thank you very much. Let's go through our prayer concerns that are on here. Robert and Bonnie, we want to pray for the Tebows as they're traveling in London with their son and son-in-law, daughter-in-law, and new grandchild. Continued prayer for Liam Blake in the hospital. Turns out Laura's got to do 2 more weeks of school because of that, so because of this lady. Vicky Kahn, travel mercies for the next 3 weeks. We're going to miss you, Vicky, on that one.
Where y'all going?
She's going.
I'm going to UAE and India,
Nice.
Singapore and Bangkok,
Nice.
and around the world.
Wow, cool.
Yeah.
I'm going out to Cedar Hill for a weekend.
Jim, you hold the fort down. It's with a prayer for Susan Leonard as she recovers from cracked pelvis. Is this a fall?
I don't know.
I don't know, it disappeared on the
I
carrier.
saw it, and we talked to Linda Garner this morning, and she said she fell, but I mean, she thought she fell, but I don't know even what
I don't know.
circumstances.
I emailed her, she just said she had a crack in her pelvis.
Oh, boy.
I didn't ask what happened.
Okay. The next one is a prayer for the family of Alvin Burns. Is that?
He died.
Oh. Laura and I went to church with his brother Ned in Austin. Alvin died. Was that this weekend? I mean, this week or?
That's all I know is when I was welcoming downstairs, that what Mona Brown was saying, that he passed away Friday night.
White spot.
Yes, yes.
White Burns' father.
And then Patty Keith, you see Patty is not here today. Patty is taking care of her mother, Clyda Walker, in the hospital with pulmonary embolism and deep vein thrombosis. And so we'll pray for Patty as she takes care of her and for her mother as well. Are there other prayer requests that we have?
We have the new member that a couple of weeks ago, and I don't have his name, but he's the one that had just been, he joined at 8:30, and he'd just been released from prison about a year before, and he was through the PEP program, Prison Entrepreneurship Program. And all I know is that his daughter completed suicide about 10 days ago. Mark notified my husband, and he put it on their care notes that go out after the service. And I don't know anything else, but that's quite a blow for somebody. Anytime, but, you know,
His name is Charles Lanier.
that's it, thank you.
Good. All right. And Linda, what did you?
I just want prayer for my brother and his wife. They just have some issues going on, and it's real concerning to us because they have a really, really strong relationship, and he has said that they're both committed to working through it, but it's been a real challenge for them. So I just pray.
What is your brother's name?
Eric, and his wife is Renee.
Okay, thank you. All right. Anything else?
Dennis, I have a prayer of Thanksgiving.
Okay.
From October the 15th until a week ago Thursday, I've been on antibiotics and steroids for a variety of different operations and so forth. And my strength's beginning to return. And I'm beginning to feel good again. And I just am grateful for
Wonderful.
the return of health.
All right, very good. Let's pray. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day and a time to come and put the business of the world aside and to study your word, to hear it read, to read it, and to discuss it. Thank you for the leadership of Bill these last 2 weeks, and help us as we continue to go through the Old Testament. Father, we pray for Robert and Bonnie Tebow as they're traveling in London. Give them safe travels, good visits with their son and daughter-in-law and new granddaughter, and help them to come back to us safely. Father, we continue to pray for Liam Blake, who is a friend of a teacher that Laura knows at her school, that he might be able to come back home from the hospital and get back on track at home and be with the parents as they take care of him. We pray for Vicki as she travels, and give her traveling mercies the next 3 weeks as she's all over the world, and bring her back to us safely as well. And Father, we pray for Susan Leonard as she recovers from a cracked pelvis, and give her the strength and energy and as she goes through rehab and gets stronger and is able to come back to us as well. Father, we pray for the family of Alvin Burns, those who loved him and cared for him as he is departed from us. And please be with his family in these days ahead as they carry on life without Alvin. Father, we pray for